I'm sure somewhere out there in the infinite possibilities there is a version of me that thinks this is a good idea. I really thought I was gonna take the night off tonight, but I have to deal with this. So when I did my video just the other day talking about Disney acquiring Fox and how X-Men could be integrated into that world, and I floated a general idea. Because, I mean, there's no reason to keep X-Men as a separate universe. I mean, Marvel's entire thing is having a single cohesive universe. And I'm not saying that's the only way to do it. In fact, heck, I wish Warner Brothers would have gotten off trying to do a shared universe and a continuity a while back and just stuck to individual franchises. But that's what Marvel has been able to make. It's big, it's coherent, it's consistent. That's kind of their whole deal. It wouldn't make sense for them to start something with X-Men that doesn't connect back. So it's going to get integrated. Now, a lot of people, like a shocking number, at least shocking to me, suggested some form of alternate reality, some form of, multiverse breaching, basically. And I responded to the first few of those I saw. Most of my responses could be summed up as some variant of no. And I got tired of typing that out every time, so now I'm gonna do this because I feel like I need to explain why I don't think that's a good idea. And I will admit my bias right up front. I'm not a big fan of multiverse stories as a thing, especially in regards to comic book material and superheroes. Now, I'm not saying there's no such thing as a good multiverse story. I'm not an idiot. I know some of them are good. I'm just saying that it's a general thing that I don't love. For me, when you do a multi-dimensional, alternate universe crossing over story, generally it works best if you're telling a very singular tale, very tight, very contained. It exists for the purposes of this. I feel the same way about time travel stories in a lot of ways. When you're telling a very specific story and using that as a function of that story, fine, it can work brilliantly. But when you try and use that as a narrative device in a bigger, sprawling, epic universe that has way more going on than just this little multiverse or time travel crossover thing you do, then honestly, you tend to just make a mess. And I'm not against the idea of alternate dimensions, alternate versions of things. I mean, I love Elseworlds, and I'm fine with all that. It's just the stories where things cross over I tend to not really like. They have a tendency to honestly just be massive continuity wanks. I mean, the iconic multiverse story is DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths, which existed solely as a massive continuity thing. And I mean, in sort of singling out Crisis on Infinite Earths, in a lot of ways emphasizes what I don't like about the use of crossing over multiverses as a thing. And it also points to why I don't think it's a good idea. Because the primary reason, or at least the official primary reason for why DC did the Crisis on Infinite Earths event, which if you don't know a ton about that, DC Comics had a multiverse, and multiverses, there was like an Earth 1 and Earth 2, all these different variants, and sometimes the characters would cross between them. But in the 80s, they collapsed it all down into a single universe through an event they called Crisis on Infinite Earths. A big part of the reason why they did that is because they were having trouble growing their sales beyond their existing customer base. They were having a real hard time luring new people in. And they determined that one of the reasons, probably not the only reason, maybe not even the primary reason, it's really hard to say. This stuff is difficult to parse out, and it's all based on tests and focus groups and whatever. But they did come to the conclusion that part of the problem is the multiverse is confusing and it's off-putting for new or more casual fans. And anecdotally, my experience backs that up. That's part of the reason I couldn't ever really get into DC, because multiverses and crossing between them and doing stuff with them has always been more DC's thing than Marvel's. I mean, Marvel has multiple universes. It technically does have a multiverse. It does exist. But DC is much more into just actually milking stories out of that than Marvel tends to be. So maybe that's my first thing. I feel like multiverse stories are DC's bag and not Marvel's. Marvel's bag in the first place. But that, again, that story existed basically just to do continuity. And it wasn't even a bad story, but the fact is it was a continuity fix first and a narrative second. And that is the kind of approach to storytelling that, I'm sorry, gave us Batman v Superman, because that movie was built around not only the intention of moving Superman forward in the timeline and the arc that Zack Snyder wanted to do, but it had to include Batman, and it had to include Wonder Woman, and it had to set up the Justice League, and it had to set up Darkseid, and it had to do all of these things not because it actually served the core narrative of that movie, but because it had to do all this continuity stuff. There was a bunch of elements of that movie that were continuity first and helpful to the narrative a distant second. So you gotta watch out for prioritizing that way. I think it's very rare that a story that's being told primarily as either a marketing or a continuity fix is almost never a truly great story in and of itself. But sort of getting back to what I was saying, that sort of layered and very complex continuity is incredibly rewarding for hardcore fans and people who stick with it, but is off-putting to casual fans. And I've said this before, and I will keep saying it. People like me, and like I kind of assume most of my subscriber base, the people who are really in and enjoy digging through and picking through the minutia and absorbing all this stuff, the hardcore people, we need to understand we are not enough to keep these franchises going on film, because film is expensive, these movies are expensive, and we alone cannot make them profitable. They have to have some degree of mainstream appeal. If they start putting off the mainstream by doing things like integrating a multiverse, which is confusing and off-putting if you're not really into all the detail stuff, these things aren't going to make the money they need to make to keep going. But even beyond that, I just don't think there's anything to be gained out of trying to introduce the X-Men into the MCU through some sort of multiverse tactic. And also, I want to point something else out, because a couple of people in the comments brought up Ant-Man and the Wasp and like, oh, they said they're bringing in the multiverse. No, they didn't. Well, they sort of did, but not in the way you're now claiming, because you're talking about two different kinds of multiverse. Actually, the first Ant-Man and also Doctor Strange brought in was this idea of different realms, different layers of reality, the quantum verse, the not dark universe, or whatever the heck it was that Dormammu existed in. So that stuff is being introduced, but that's not the kind of multiverse that you're talking about when you're talking about the sort of continuity, reality ripping, different versions of characters coming in, because that is more about alternate versions of the reality that we know, as opposed to completely different types of reality, which is what things like the quantum verse and Dormammu's realm actually are. So no, Marvel has not laid in the groundwork for a multiverse, not in that way. That having been said, I do understand that there are, or soon will be, elements in the MCU that will allow for multiverse not only existence, but crossover. It would be very simple. There's a lot going on. I mean, the Infinity Gauntlet alone, heck, you wouldn't even need the whole Infinity Gauntlet. Just the reality gem could give you enough leeway to mess with things, to create alternate versions and bring in, the X-Men from another reality. You wouldn't even necessarily need that. They haven't really specifically laid out exactly how Scarlet Witch's powers work in the MCU. They seem a little bit more key, but traditionally her powers are reality warping. So she already appears to be getting stronger, and if it gets laid out that what she is actually doing is actually warping and affecting reality, they could push her to a point that she actually tears a hole in reality and creates all this stuff. So, and I'm sure there's other possibilities. So when I say this is a bad idea and I don't think that there's a lot to be gained from it, I'm not saying it's not possible logistically. It's absolutely possible. I still just think it's a bad idea. And the main reason I think it's a bad idea is why? Why would you do that as opposed to just starting fresh? And I know there are issues with Marvel just trying to bring in mutants. I talked about some of them in my last video. I don't want to rehash a ton of them, but I do acknowledge that there are issues with how Marvel is going to get things integrated. But I think the issues involved with that are smaller than the issues you cause by creating this weird multiverse scenario. And again, I'm going to ask, what is there actually to be gained? Because you would think the big thing that you would want by doing this thing of saying that the Fox X-Men movies were another reality and now it's crossing over and it's going to mix with the MCU would be to bring over the specific visions of those characters and, more importantly, the specific actors playing them. But with all due respect to James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender, the best and most iconic versions of the core characters, those actors are done with this franchise. Patrick Stewart's not going to play Professor Xavier again. Ian McKellen is not going to play Magneto again. But even if I accept that, okay, maybe we get McAvoy, maybe we get Fassbender, there's still a giant hole that you're left with, and it's shaped like Wolverine, because Hugh Jackman put his final stamp on the thing with Logan. He's not coming back. And there's no way that Marvel isn't going to want some version of Wolverine. He is the biggest name in X-Men. So they're gonna need to do their own version of him no matter what, and because they can't get Jackman back, they're gonna have to recast anyway. So what would the benefit be of bringing over part of this reality, but then another part of it is weird and different? And again, I understand you could explain it like, oh, well, they're from that one reality that is the Fox X-Men universe, but we pulled a Wolverine from another reality and it's this new actor. Like, again, you could do it, but this is all stupidly overly complicated. And again, I come back to the question, what are we actually gaining by doing it that way? Look, I like McAvoy, I like Fassbender in these roles, but I don't like them enough to go through this kind of weird pretzeling of the entire MCU. I think the only character that gets a pass is Deadpool because he's a fourth wall-breaking character anyway, so rules don't necessarily need to apply to him the way they do with everybody else. But as far as the rest of the X-Men universe goes, again, I'm going to ask this. Why would you necessarily want to port it over anyway? Because, look, there's a lot of specific films in the X-Men franchise that I like. I mean, I've talked about the side projects more recently, but even looking at the main series, I like Days of Future Past a lot. First Class is pretty good. I think it's a little overrated with the way some people say it's the best one. I love X2, X-Men United, but even that series doesn't really have much in the way of continuity. And I'm not just talking about the recasting. I mean, basically every film made after X-Men The Last Stand in some way contradicts or doesn't fit. Fox kind of eventually hit the point where they just went, heck with it. Which for them, honestly, was a really good move because once they were freed of trying to make the continuity make any sense anymore, they did things like Deadpool, Logan, Legion, which probably are things that wouldn't have existed if they were really having a death grip on maintaining a coherent continuity. And again, worked well for them, but Marvel has a continuity that works. Why would you integrate something from another universe that's just gonna mess all that up? And again, look, I get multiverses do have their value, they have their fun, but when you have something that is as solid as the MCU is at this point, I don't see any benefit that actually comes. And whatever little benefits you get that you have, I think is completely undone by the damage and the overcomplication that you cause by doing this sort of thing. And I feel like they've got a pretty sizable task for figuring out what to do with X-Men, because if it was completely free reign and they could make any possibility work, let's be honest, X-Men is a better fit for television than it is for movies. It's a huge ensemble cast. You could shift focus on which character we're getting from episode to episode, so we don't run into what happened with the films, which is that every single film has to focus on Wolverine or Professor X or Magneto and then later Mystique, and everyone else is just background noise. You can eliminate that by having a television show where they can each have a point of focus. And actually, the way that I think would be ideal to do it is you have films that focus on the primary, most popular, if we're being honest, X-Men the most, your Wolverines, your Magnetos, your Professor X's, and so on, and you have the other characters there, and they'll be kind of background like they always were. But those characters who are background in the film, you also have in a TV series where they get to be front and center and feel like they shine, and they get their proper due as characters, because there's a lot of characters that have shown up in the X-Men movies who literally have basically just shown up, and it feels like they've never gotten their proper due. And some of them include my favorite characters, but as much as I love that idea, they can't do it, because until Ike Perlmutter dies, I'm gonna say, And I'm not saying I wish him dead. There's very few people I wish death on. But until for some reason he gets removed, you have to keep in mind, Kevin Feige runs Marvel Films. Ike Perlmutter runs Marvel Television. The two men do not get along. This is why there isn't direct crossover between Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the movies anymore. So Marvel does have a big job ahead of them. And I get that some people think, oh, multiverse, doesn't that make it easy? Well, no, it makes it easy for you because you watch all of this stuff. You watch all the MCU, you watch all the Fox X-Men, you watch everything so you can make the leap from connecting this to this and how it all fits together. But again, we are gonna lose the mainstream audience and we need them to make the box office, because if we don't make the box office, these things don't get profitable, they stop getting made. And that is not me saying like we must compromise to make it more digestible to the casuals. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we can't get overly self-congratulatory. We need to avoid fan wank. And I'm sorry, to my way of thinking, multiverse continuity correction driven stories are fan wank. Most audiences don't care. We can still tell great, wonderful stories that are true to these characters and are adaptations of stories from the source material that we love that does not also alienate the mainstream audience. We don't have to kowtow to them, but we also need to not be shoving them away just to do something completely self-indulgent. And again, from where I sit, that's what multiverse storytelling is. Incredibly self-indulgent. But those are my reasons why, of all the possible ways to integrate X-Men into the MCU, I do not want any variant of alternate reality, alternate timelines, multiple dimensions. No. I don't want to see it. And before you try and quote me that, well, Star Trek did it with the movies and that worked, did it though? Did it really? Because all the fans ever did was complain about how it wasn't like it was before, and they eventually ended up losing mainstream interest anyway. And the third one, which a lot of Star Trek fans think is the best one, had the worst box office because people didn't stick around. So don't try and cite that to me as a way in which it works, because it didn't really work, did it? And that got a little more confrontational than I usually try and be. I think I'm just tired. Is the problem. I really needed to take tonight off, but I didn't. I ranted at this camera because I needed to get it out of my system, and also because I love you people. So those are my thoughts on all of this. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Don't forget to like, subscribe. Check me out on Twitter at Council of Geeks. Give a listen to the Council of Geeks podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts as well as Stitcher Radio. I'm also one half of the Punch Like a Girl podcast. That is a presentation of the Fire and Water Podcast Network, fireandwaterpodcast.com. Links for all this stuff is down in the description. And until next time, this council is adjourned.